Jeremy, I'll come to you first. Tony talked about wanting to sort of encourage people. How did he encourage you?
This is very difficult for me, really, because looking at the film tonight, I felt Tony's still alive. He wasn't gone to me, he was still here. And I knew Tony ever since 1969. I first met him. I was a young activist around the place being a young activist, and I went to a meeting that he spoke at after the 1970 election defeat. And it was a very small meeting, and he just sat down with a whole pile of papers and spoke for about 45 minutes about the power of multinational capital over national governments and the danger to democracy that presented from his experience of being a cabinet minister. All the other defeated cabinet ministers in Blackpool that year were going around blaming opinion polls, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the Labour Party organisation, anything you like. Tony was the only one that had any profound analysis of what had happened to that election. And the way that Tony always inspired me was that he went to the heart of the matter and gave profound answers to very serious questions. So the point right at the end of the film when he says there's only two things in the world, and that's people and land. And how you divide that up is actually a very profound question. I worked very closely with him, both in the unions in the 1970s, when he was with Applied Shipbuilders. I was in the engineering union. He was promoting industrial democracy. And I've never forgotten, it won't be long, I promise, 1976, cabinet minister, height of the IMF crisis, height of all the media oppression and attacks on him, and old enough, the people in this audience are old enough to remember what it was like, the way he was vilified. He found time to write a very serious statement about the lessons of the levellers to the current democratic struggle, and went to Burford to make this speech and give this lecture. A cabinet minister, height of his power, if you like, and all that. And then I worked very closely with him throughout the miners' strike, and I was just amazed at the energy of the guy. We would literally be off at picket lines at 5:30 in the morning. We'd be doing stuff all day with the miners. In those days, Parliament didn't start till the afternoon. We'd get back to London at some point. We would then go straight to Parliament and start raising questions on behalf of the miners immediately. And we would be there till 10 or 11 at night. Next day, same thing, back on it. For a year. He was never not there for the miners. He felt passionately about the miners. He came here at this very hall. He stood about where your foot is and spoke from here on miners. And then the last part of his life, he was always accused of moving to the left in his old age and becoming more international as he got older. He really understated himself and undersold himself then, because I'm now the chair of Liberation, which started as the movement of colonial freedom. And I was looking through our records, and he took up the cause of the victims of the British Army's behaviour in Kenya in 1955 in Parliament at that time. He was a founder of the movement of colonial freedom. He was a founder of the Committee Against the H Bomb, which later morphed into CND. And the latter part of his life, he worked very, very hard in Stop the War Coalition against Afghanistan, against the war in Iraq, and here we go again, back in Parliament on Friday for the third time I've been invited to vote to bomb Iraq. Well, the news I've got, in memory of Tony and for justice, no, I will not vote to bomb Iraq. It really, towards the end of his life, he was devastated by the loss of Caroline. And he was somebody that didn't easily talk in a personal sense. But I remember when Caroline was dying, and after she died, he quite often phoned me up. And a few days after she died, he phoned me one Sunday morning, and he was on the phone for probably nearly an hour. And Tony didn't talk personal most of his life, but he was so devastated by that. And after she died, and he stopped being an MP, he became very busy, but to the credit of the House of Commons, he was made a freeman of the House of Commons. which meant he could go anywhere except the chamber. So he used to come wandering into the tea room and sit down with John MacDonald and me and say, "Well, comrades, what treacheries at work today?" And then we'd go through where the treachery was on. But he was happiest in Stop the War Coalition. He was happiest with the anti-war movement and the peace movement. And we saw him quite a lot while he was in hospital and so on before he died. And the last time we saw him, Lara and I went there just after I'd come back from a delegation to the Western Sahara, which is under occupation. And we walked in, and Hilary said, "Oh, don't be long, he's very tired." And he was sort of in the bed like this, and he's perfect. He said, "Oh, Jeremy, comrade, I'm glad you're here. Now, where have you been?" So I said, "I've just come back from the Western Sahara." He said, "Ah, now what is happening there? Tell me all about it." And this was a guy who, right at the end of his life, desperate thirst for knowledge, for information and ideas. In Tony's memory, always listen to what people say, particularly if they're saying something unexpected. And in Tony's life, there is something that's imparted to all of us in our belief that ordinary people can achieve real change in society. Tony was a great man in lots of ways. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll come to you next because you're next in line. What do you think his legacy is, as far as you're concerned?
Well, one of the things that I learned most about Tony, I was working on his biography for 2 years, seeing him sometimes every day, doing some quite intense interviews with him about different parts of his life that I had that I researched. And then that book came out, and then 20 years later, I updated it again, having seen him over the intervening period. So, all in all, I knew him and was questioning him over 25 years. And one of the things that really struck me was he didn't stop. He didn't stop learning, he didn't stop doing things, he didn't stop changing his mind and learning things. And one of the things he told me right near the end of his life was how it was his grandchildren who made him change his mind on the law-related cannabis. That he's that old and he's still thinking about things, thinking it through and listening to people who are distant from him at many generations. So there was that about his legacy that he can pass on to us, that you don't ever have to stop. And the thing that really brought this home to me was 2000 to 2001. Everything's in decline. The newspapers are in decline. There's almost no decent current affairs coverage on television. There aren't any meetings taking place. The political parties are in decline. You don't get halls with politicians talking or with anyone talking about contemporary issues. And that's when Tony started the audience with Tony Benn. And it was at the suggestion of a theatre impresario who discovered that the one thing that could fill a wet Wednesday in Swindon was Tony Benn talking about his diary. So he approached Tony and said, "Look, would you mind just talking about yourself? Just go in and put together a show." And so Tony did this audience with Tony Benn. I'm sure quite a few people here would have attended one. For half the time, he would give a talk about politics, about the multinationals, about the decline of empires, and some big issues, huge topics. And then for the other half, people he'd sit there with his pipe and his cup of tea, and people would ask him questions. And at a time when politics was supposedly in decline and people weren't engaging, he was getting 1,000, 2,000 paying people coming into the town halls, wanting to engage in political debate, wanting to talk, wanting to understand, wanting to hear each other's views. They didn't want the intervention of the journalists and the pundits and the focus groups and all the other things that have made our politics what it is today. They wanted to be there with people, and Tony was bringing them together and helping them to talk. And so, if you want to see his legacy, look around, because it's meetings like this that Tony brought us to. That's what he's left us with.
Very much. Clark, I know that he was enormously important to you, wasn't he? Very encouraging to musicians.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not something that's widely discussed, his influence on musicians, but actually, if I can go back to a quick story about my own father, because there is a relationship with part of Tony Benn's story. My father was also in the RAF in World War II, and like Tony Benn, and of course a lot of the people who experienced that very difficult time, they witnessed dreadful destruction, annihilation of entire peoples. I'm very affected by this, and for those who were demobbed, survived, a lot of them had a dream of building a much better world, a peaceful world, and a socially just world. So, obviously, we know Tony Benn went into politics and became really the voice of that generation initially, that generation of people who were determined not to go back to the situation and circumstances that brought about World War II. My father became a jazz musician. That was another area of breaking down of restriction, of racial segregation, and he became a member of the British Communist Party. So my dad used to talk to me about Tony Benn being one of the few people, one of the few politicians of that time, who I should really pay attention to. And you know, because he said to us, you can make a difference, your voice is important, that had a huge effect on us musicians, us kids of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And if you think about the musical trajectory that happened in those eras, a lot was said, a lot of social commentary was made. People talked about the need for peace, the anti-war movement, the need for gender equality, racial equality, and then of course the environmental movement. And his most important message to me was that it's not just that you need to be heard, it's that you have a moral obligation to state your case. If you want to improve the world, if you want to create a better world, I know I'm talking in generalities, but I can't tell you how important that was as a musician to hear that, because, of course, we had the ability and have the ability to share our very voices with all of you. And the question is, what are we going to say? If you look at the government, the kind of government we have today, and you want to know maybe one of the reasons why we have that kind of government, listen to music. You want to know why we have the kind of music on the radio that we have today, look at the government. It wasn't always thus. I was at the People's Climate March at the weekend. I don't know if any of you were there as well. It was a wonderful, wonderful movement and a wonderful moment, knowing that people all around the world were doing what Tony Benn had told us we should do. Again, that's ethical imperative. Stand up for what is right. And you know what the incredible thing is in watching this fantastic film, by the way, wonderful, beautiful film, is that it reminds me that you won't always get rewarded for doing the right thing. In fact, unfortunately, you rarely will. And as a musician, I wrestle with that. Because it's hard for any of us to survive in these times. These are difficult times. But the inspiring thing, once again, in hearing Tony Benn speak, is that, you know what? Doing the right thing is more important.
Thank you, Jeremy. Are you proud of your film?
Very much so. I mean, this event is the last of we've been around about 10 cities in this country, and one of the things Tony asked before the film was released to the cinema, that we go around the town halls and assembly rooms of the country and have meetings like this, is he wanted he wants to get this sort of message out to the people. And another thing, when we were filming, he'd always be wandering off, and you find him chatting to a group of people, especially young people, and he was still passionate and still got everybody talking and chatting. And wherever we went, if we were in a concert hall or a cinema or whatever, he'd just fill it with people queuing around the block. It was, he had a fringe for two. We did a short version of the film just so that Tony could go around and sit and talk to Tony and the film, and it was inspired everybody.
Thank you very much, Mike. Okay. There are some microphones around, I think. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can put your hand up, and a microphone will make its way to you. I'll try not to. Is there anybody who wants to ask one? Maybe not. Oh yes, the gentleman in that room. Could you keep your hand up, sir? And great, thank you.
Hi, thanks again for the film tonight. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering if the panel perhaps talk about what Benn's thoughts would be on the current debates around the English Parliament as a response to the no vote in Scotland, particularly.
Anybody? Jeremy?
He wouldn't have been pleased, I think, that there was a vote in Scotland. He was certainly in favour of people having a choice and self-determination, if you like, and that was certainly his position. I don't remember him ever saying anything in favour of having an English Parliament, not as I recall anyway, and I don't think there's anything in his diaries that suggested that.
It was anti-devolution, wasn't it? He had Scottish ancestry and he wanted to see it.
Yeah, he was basically largely in favour of a unitary state and in a quite centralised state in some ways. But then on the other side of it was when the abolition of the GLC happened under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and with it the abolition of the metropolitan counties, he was very strong in his defence of the power of local government. And so I think it's difficult to know at this distance, but I think he would be in favour of some kind of strengthened local government, regional local government in England, as, if you like, a balance to the idea of what is now, I guess, accepted devolution in Scotland and Wales. Over Ireland, he wasn't very involved in Irish issues for a very long time. But then, when the Troubles happened, he then became much more involved. And I went to Ireland with him many times. And the most poignant thing we did was we went to Supergrass trials. That was where there was a juryless trial with somebody who would be giving Queen's evidence and in return would get anonymity, change of identity, and a large sum of money and so on. And Tony and I turned up to witness one of these Supergrass trials. And when we arrived, the court usher said, "Where are you two going?" And I said, "We're going to the public gallery." He said, "There's no point going there because we've put glass screens up on it and everybody in there's so angry they're scratched all over it, so you won't be able to see or hear anything." So I said, "Well, what's the point of having the public gallery then?" He said, "Well, good question. But if you two want to hear it, you can come into the well of the court, as you're both members of Parliament." So we were taken into the well of the court. There was nowhere to sit except the empty jury box. So we were put in the jury box, and the barrister of the defence said he was pleased at last a jury had been impanelled. It was rather a small one, but he trusted our judgment to solve the issue. So Tony came to the issue of Irish unity and Irish self-determination in a very, very strong way. And it was very interesting. Almost, this is the point about Tony, he was learning the whole time. And I remember a discussion, lengthy discussion with a number of women in Ireland after we'd been to that Supergrass trial, and we were going to Old Girls Airport to come back. And he was then he wrote all about this in his diary, his beginnings of that involvement with Ireland. So Tony was this passion always to find something out. I mean, I could go on forever about this, but I'm going to stop. You're going to take the microphone off me.
We're going to have more questions, I think.
What do you thought about the actual Scottish referendum? His mother came and proposed it, but when we were up in Glasgow, of course everybody was asking him a couple of years ago, but and he just said if there was a yes vote, he would have felt torn in half. He really was hoping for a no vote.
He was, I remember. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the film. Really enjoyed it. It's great. If Tony was interviewed this morning by John Humphreys on Radio 4, what would he have said about the speech yesterday? What would he say?
That's interesting. Jad, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, certainly. Tony was always generous about his colleagues. Tony was the exemplar of speech making. He could make a speech at a drop of a hat, but in fact, these impromptu remarks and this wonderful off-the-cuff speech making had been carefully studied. He worked very hard on his speeches. He was sympathetic to his colleagues if they were having trouble with their speeches, but I do remember him acting with contempt, and I think it's in the diaries, about Neil Kinnock having to read a speech at his stage in life, leader of a political party, reading a speech as if it's because he just doesn't have the ideas in his head. So I can see what Ed Miliband was doing. He was moving towards the idea that his principles are so firmly entrenched in his mind, that he's so much in command of his material, that he doesn't need a written speech to refer to. Unfortunately, he did need notes. But I know Tony would have been utterly sympathetic and would have said something very witty about it, but he wouldn't have criticised a colleague in public.
Thank you very much. Another question, lady at the back there.
Hi. I thought the film was absolutely amazing and did him a lot of justice that he deserves. One of the questions I like, apart from your good people there and Jeremy, if Tony Benn was looking at politicians in this day and age within our parliament, which ones would he hold in this art as having the same amount of integrity and sincerity and boldness, which could guide us in some ways, because I feel very let down and cynical about politicians, apart from himself, obviously. So.
Is there any member of the panel you want in particular to answer that question?
Jeremy.
Would Tony think that, who would Tony admire and believe had the same integrity as him in today's politics among?
Tony was just one of these incredibly generous people, and that he would always find the best in everybody. I mean, he would sort of say, in fact, I know he was very critical of Neil Kinnock, and I heard him make plenty of criticism of Neil Kinnock. When we lost the 1992 election, he was the only one that phoned Neil Kinnock up the next day and said, look, he was really sorry about it, because he knew he'd worked really hard to try to win that. So he was somebody that was incredibly generous, and he did have a great deal of respect from a lot of MPs in other parties as well as Labour. He also had a lot of Labour MPs that utterly detested him, and he quite enjoyed that as well, actually. And the arguments he had with various people, particularly during the deputy leadership campaign in 1981. But again, even throughout that campaign, he was quite generous with Dennis Healey, and they all had a good laugh when we produced this poster. I don't know if you remember the film Raging Bull. We produced this poster because Dennis Healey had a famously bad temper, called Dennis to Helium, the Raging Bull, with a picture of Dennis Healey on it, which Tony thought was very funny, and eventually Dennis Healey thought it was very funny, and then Dennis Healey went and supported him in the Chesterfield by-election, which was quite remarkable. Who he would admire in Parliament? He once said something quite profound about Margaret Thatcher. He said something like, I mean, she made the kind of speeches she was making all the time. She said, at least she believes in something. And I wish our side, the Labour side, would believe in people and socialism in the way that she believed in inequality and capitalism. That's what Tony said.
quick jump in.
I had the good fortune of meeting him a couple of years ago at the Labour Party conference, and well, he was treated quite badly by a Labour Party conference, and he was on all the fringe talks and so on, of which I attended because I admired him greatly. I have a photograph with him, which I really love. But I have to say, I have one criticism of him, and I told him at the time, working within the Labour Party was compromise. He felt that working within the Labour Party was one way of bringing it forward. Now, I disagree with him on that. I think the Labour Party is sold out all the way, and he didn't say a bad word about it. The other person that he really did admire was the young Owen Jones. Oh, yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, I personally can't work within the Labour Party, and I disagree with him on that.
Thank you very much.
Can I just comment on that?
Yes, certainly.
Because I'm actually a Green Party member, and it's a who have incorporated what it amounts to clause 4 in their constitution as well. But the fact is that there is not everything that I agree with about the Green Party. And there are certain elements of their policy that I find run contrary to my view of the world, and a good deal of it that I agree with. But I do think that idea that you look at what is out there and you work with it and you try and make it work to the best of your ability is a noble thing. That idea, I think Tony Benn said in the book I Really Dare to Be Young, he said that socialism is often equated with nationalisation, but he said actually that's not the case. Socialism is about cooperation. And I was really quite shocked about that. I'm a musician and I very much like being a solo artist or in a band, but that was quite confronting. It made me really reassess the idea of being a member of a party and why that sense of cooperation is important.
Thank you very much. Jeremy,
very quickly, I think a point about Tony's life was that he was always involved in mass campaigns that were peripheral to the direct involvement within the Labour Party, and he saw those mass campaigns as a way of putting pressure on the whole political system. Hence his involvement with CND, with Stop the War, Appetite Shipbuilders, Institute of Workers' Control, a whole lot of things, and obviously all the trade union campaigns involved in. And when he ran for deputy leader, he didn't spend his time solely focusing on the delegate vote structure and all that sort of thing. He sought to use the deputy leadership campaign in 1981 as a way of building popular support for radical socialist ideas, which would then influence on the whole political system. And they certainly did have a huge influence on the whole political system. So he saw politics as exciting people in the broadest possible canvas, and that way you bring about degrees of political change.
Jad, did you want to add something further?
Yes, if I could just briefly. Tony was very loyal to the Labour Party, and he considered loyalty to be a virtue, even when he didn't entirely agree with the party. And sometimes he voted against it, sometimes he argued against its policies. But basically he saw it as the party which had been created by working people, by the trade unions, the intellectual societies like the Fabians and the cooperative societies, been created by working people to further their own ambitions, and he felt that that was the proper vehicle he should be working in. And if it wasn't good enough, then he'd got to work harder to make it better.
There's so much more to be said. I'm sorry I didn't get down the questions, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to my panel.